Okay, good morning and welcome to this, the fifth meeting of 2013 of the European External Relations Committee. Can I make the usual request that all electronic devices and mobiles are switched off because they interfere with our broadcasting? And before we kick off this morning, could I just extend the apologies of Jamie McGregor, who's unwell this morning and won't be joining us. So moving on to agenda item 1, which is our foreign language and learning in primary schools inquiry. We'll take further evidence today from experts, or panel of experts who are representing the trade teaching unions today. With us we have Hugh Donnelly, who is a member of the Education Committee of the Educational Institute of Scotland, EIS, GILLIAN PURVES, the National Executive Member, the Association Heads and Deputies of Scotland, AHDS, and Linda Gray is National Executive Member of the National Association of Schoolmasters Union of Women Teachers, NASUWT. Well, welcome and thank you for coming along this morning. Members will see within their papers we have a late paper from EIS this morning, so no doubt you'll have a quick scan through that and hopefully some questions. I think we're just going to go straight to question, if you're comfortable with that, and we're going straight to Claire Adamson. Claire.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. First question is about the funding that the Scottish Government has proposed for the 1+2 proposals. If they're funding the pilots by £120,000 and are suggesting £4 million to implement. And I was just wondering if you had done any work on estimating what the costs might be, or you think that that's a sufficient amount of money to actually implement this in the whole of Scotland.
Well, we haven't done any work of that kind of detail, and we have done no audit on what would actually be necessary. I think that would take some more consideration and probably some comparison with what has previously been invested in similar programmes. However, it would appear that given the ambition and the challenge of the recommendations, that the £4 million perhaps may not be enough to advance the ambitions inherent in this project. So quite clearly, I think more work would have to be done in terms of audit, more discussions with local authorities and trade unions.
Thank you.
I would have to agree with that wholeheartedly. I think the funding proposals need to be based on a plan of action and an implementation plan, and you need to know how you intend, if you intend to implement, how you intend to do it, and in what manner, and using which staff, and with whatever sort of appropriate training. And I don't think you can base a funding model on this is how much we've got, this is how much we'll give. It has to be fully funded, properly funded, and properly resourced. So I think £4 million might be just a shade on the short side.
We also agree with that. We've done a big job to try and work out the funding for our organisation. One of our concerns would be that often a pilot is funded, but the rollout that follows it is not funded to the same extent. And with ever decreasing budgets, it would be quite a challenge.
I think could I just add as well? I mean, I think it's important in terms of not just the amount, but how the money is actually channelled as well. And I do understand that ring fencing is not terribly fashionable at the moment, but I think that would have to be considered at one point. And if not ring fencing, I think certainly you would need a model which incentivised local authorities to target the money on this particular project. Now, that's not an easy one. That's not an easy issue to resolve. But I certainly think that ring fencing, in a project of this nature, of this scale, of this ambition, I think quite clearly you would need a model which certainly did incentivise or oblige local authorities to spend the money on promoting languages. There are instances quite clearly in the present round of cuts whereby money allocated for certain purposes have actually been anticipated in advance, shelved and then offset against cuts. And quite clearly, any arrangement like this would be an opportunity to be missed in this context.
Willie Coffey.
Thanks, Convener. Just to come in the back of this, I mean, it's a fairly gloomy, doomy morning outside, and we've kind of started off with a slightly gloomy approach to this, I feel. Could I ask you to help the committee out a wee bit more here? Ultimately, we are going to make some recommendations to the Scottish Government about this initiative, and various people have said it's not enough, it's not enough. You're the professionals at the coalface here, and we're kind of depending on your advice as well. Is there no additional help you can give us about how much you think this should really require to kick-start it and properly implement it? We don't want to be in a position to say to the Scottish Government, we don't think it's enough money. I mean, you've got the professional advice you can bring to the table for us, and it would be great if you'd be able to at least offer some additional assistance to the committee. Nobody else has done, I'll say that. So, I mean, it's an opportunity for you to let the committee know, and therefore the Scottish Government, what you think we require to get this really, really exciting initiative for Scotland and Scotland's school children up and running.
I think perhaps the reason nobody else has been happy to offer you advice in that direction is because it's not an area that has been extensively investigated by the associations. Certainly we haven't investigated the funding angle. We have appreciated that the potential funding proposed is probably not adequate to meet the need. But until you identify how you propose to take this forward, whether you intend to use secondary staff who are released into primary schools to deliver on a peripatetic basis, whether you have fully funded MFL trained primary teachers, whether you go on what sort of basis you go on will dictate how much it's going to cost. If you go down the fully funded MFL route, you are looking at day release for a teacher for 40 weeks to do it properly. And if that's the route you choose, you therefore have that cost. Presumably, if you want to do it across Scotland and have absolute equity of provision, you have to have one teacher from every school who is trained in one language, maybe two. Maybe you need two teachers. There are far bigger issues than the cost.
So that's fairly detailed, Mrs. Gray. You've offered quite a lot of detail there. Is there a price tag attached to that? From our perspective, I have no idea. I know when I personally did the MFL German training, I was released for a day a week from school over 40 weeks to achieve a level of German that I was happy and comfortable with, and that the school were happy and comfortable with. So somebody else could hear what you're saying and kind of work out what that might cost. Well, you work out what a day release for a teacher is. At the moment, the biggest issue is getting supply. You cannot find supply, particularly in the primary sector, with any great ease. And until that situation is resolved, it has a knock-on effect on the impact elsewhere. Right. Mrs. Purves or Mr. Donnelly, any additional help you can give us?
I totally agree on the supply. As a head teacher of a reasonably big primary, I'm regularly covering classes currently. I have colleagues who've done it for 3 weeks constantly. So that is a big challenge at the moment that needs to be overcome before you can release anybody for training, never mind covering basic sickness within schools. The biggest thing, I mean, teachers have the methodologies for delivering the language, but see, in my authority, we did an audit, and trying to ascertain people's language skills, you don't have many teachers sitting with a higher in a language, let alone 2 languages, in our current staffing. Now, I imagine if you replicate that across Scotland, it would be quite a similar picture. I recently advertised for a teacher to cover our French, because it's in Falkirk, it's done in a specialist. I only got 3 applicants. 1 wasn't GTC registered, and 2 did not give enough information that you would interview them. So there's a real issue of the language skill. Teachers have the skills in the primary to deliver curriculum for excellence. We did try something with secondary, but a lot of secondary teachers weren't comfortable coming to a different type of methodology. They would need training, I think, many secondary teachers, to be comfortable with delivery. But there's a big issue with the basic having the language.
We're coming to that. I think we're coming to that. Yeah. I just wanted to get a wee bit more on this issue about the initial investment in the pilot and the £4 million implementation phase, and just to see whether we can put some flesh around about that at all?
I think a lot of research shows, and I've done the training as Linda has. I did it in French, and I was a practitioner in a class, and it was immersion. Those children doing daily routines of learning a language were far more confident and could then use their language skills than somebody who gets an hour a week from a drop-in teacher. The other problem with training one teacher in each school across Scotland, teachers move. A school is very quickly left without that trained teacher. They move on as well. I mean, the cost is, I think, probably a very, very large one. I wouldn't like to even put a figure on it. Your 4 million's a drop in the ocean.
Drop in the ocean. Mr Donnelly, any
Yeah,
further?
the Modern Languages in Primary Schools project, dating back to the 90s, I think there are lessons to be learned there, quite clearly, the successes of that project and the limitations of that project. And there was also a price tag associated with that as well. Now, I think that would clearly show that the £4 million is a drop in the ocean. I think also that the scale of the ambition of this policy did surprise a lot of people in education, particularly practitioners on the ground, where, for example, we have experienced the removal of foreign language assistants in the last couple of years. Now, that shows two things. That shows a lack of priority with regard to delivering languages on the ground. But perhaps more realistically, it actually reflects the problems that local authorities have in terms of budgets. But when you have a necessary element, a traditional element, which is all about reciprocity as well, because if we stop accepting foreign language assistance, France will stop receiving our young qualified teachers as well. I mean, there has got to be an ambition here. But we also know, as I've said, it's not just about the global sums of money. We have to understand where the money has to be spent. And there would have to be discussions with the universities with regard to initial teacher education, but also with regard to career-long professional development. I think that one of the weaknesses of the Modern Languages in Primary Schools project was that it didn't really track the people who were trained. A lot of people moved to different schools, lots of money spent on their training, etc. And then when they moved schools, as a resource, they were not properly deployed. So also there are many teachers who we have invested in terms of the Modern Languages Primary Schools project, and the ongoing career-long professional development hasn't taken place. The language becomes unused, and that's a resource that remains dormant. Now, there is some work that can be done there in terms of trying to utilise that resource, identify these teachers and deploy them as part of this project. But at the end of the day, we're going to need a lot more upfront in terms of initial teacher education. I'd just like to add one thing as well. It's not just about specialists or not specialists. There are quite clearly options for introducing a blended provision, tiered provision in terms of teachers. The GTCS have a programme not only of professional registration that you'll be aware of, but also of professional recognition as well. It is quite possible, and this is a model that is applied informally in schools, where you actually do have specialists and external supports who can actually support schools in the delivery of such a project, but also you can have teachers who may not have the same specialist qualifications, but who quite clearly could have professional development in a language to a certain level. Also, if that became a core part of initial teacher education as well, that would quite clearly give priorities about the importance of teaching languages. But all of that takes planning, and all of that takes resources. This is a significant project. I think we're all sitting here today. We don't want to be gloomy. We would love to be optimistic, but we are aware of the practical realities on the ground,
Okay,
and that professional voice has to be listened to, because they have identified what the obstacles are in taking this forward.
I'm listening, Mr Donnelly. I'm putting you in the spot. How much does it need? You're the EIS. When we're relying on advice from yourself, you're from the EIS. How much does this need?
It would be...
It's a drop in the ocean at 4, so what's the right amount?
Well, I mean, as I said, I mean, it wouldn't be wise to put a figure on it here this morning. Okay. As I says, there are various aspects which quite clearly have to be considered. I think the first point of reference. To find an answer. I don't know if anybody else sitting here has offered you a figure. I wouldn't imagine they would be so unwise to do so. But what I would suggest is...
everybody's happy to say it's a drop in the ocean.
I think, yes. I think we have to go realistically look at the Modern Languages Primary Schools project. We actually have quite a successful model there, but there are lessons to be learned from that as well. There was a price tag associated with that. Okay. It's partly arithmetical, but it's also logistical as well. Okay. But I'm not in a position to give you a figure today, I'm afraid.
Thanks a lot. Very helpful anyway. Thanks.
Okay, Hanzala Malik.
Yeah, good morning and welcome. I want to start off with you. I like a comment you make in point 12 of your report, and this is in regards with EIE welcomes the approach to language learning in line with Scotland's development as a diverse, multicultural, multilingual nation. Interesting comment. But then I think you've not really had the chance to develop that, and your contribution to date actually verifies that in the sense that you've not quite been able to put the finger on the pulse in terms of the overall cost implication. And as an organization as yours, I would have thought that you may have invested some resource in trying to identify that area. I think there is a clear recognition in the last meeting we had. There was a lot of conversation around the resource issue. And I think even at the last meeting, like yourself this morning, it was a unanimous view that the resource wasn't sufficient. However, questions asked from the committee are also very relevant, in which they're saying, okay, if this is a drop in the ocean, what is the figure? So it would have been really helpful if someone could come back to us and say, well, we guesstimate this figure at this amount. Now, I know that there's one or two areas that you've touched upon as a group, which is that what is the source of our learning, which teachers or volunteers we're going to use, and whether it's going to be ring-fenced or not. These are very valid points. I take them on totally. And you're quite right. We would have to develop the policy a little bit more deeper than we have to date. And I think that this idea about, that there's a sum of money, I think the sum of money isn't so much that the government has sought it appropriate. I think it's just a pot of money that they had that they felt they could maybe invest in this area. So what they're now looking for is how do we maximize that, and can we actually make it meaningful? And this is where your advice would be really crucial. Now, you've given us some very good indications already in terms of where the expense could go. But one of the things that I'm also looking at, that you say that teaching between 3 and 18 is crucial, it's important. And I would agree with that. That's number 14 of your report. I agree with that as well. However, I still genuinely believe that we as a committee are looking towards you to make some sort of commitment to us that you can actually come back to us with more meat on the bone by saying, it is our guesstimate. You will also be making an estimate on various aspects of this, that this is where we think, and this is what we think the resource really needs to be. That would help us a lot, because as my colleagues have already pointed out, we need to go back to the government and suggest what is probably more doable on the ground. There's no point in us trying to launch an aspiration unprepared. This is where your support is crucial for us. Could you possibly come back to this committee with some sort of indication of where you think the resource wouldn't be needed the most, and what sort of price tag that would have to it?
In terms of the EIS, certainly I can take that request away for more consideration to be given to resources. I don't think it's an easy one, no. But certainly that's certainly something I can take away and explore with my colleagues. I would be welcome. I would be welcome to do that. In terms of this policy, this initiative, this commitment by the government, I think quite clearly it has to be welcomed. And at the very least, if it doesn't achieve the ambitions that are laid out in this paper, if it even begins to reverse the decline that we've seen in the teaching of modern languages, because we are very good at making excuses about our failure to advance the project of modern languages. I don't think it is inevitable. And I also must say, I don't think it's an option not to take up this challenge. But we do have to be realistic. If you look at the Scottish Centre for Languages survey last year, it quite clearly identified, above all else, teachers were saying, okay, even if we had the funding, even if we had the teachers, where would this fit into the curriculum? Where would this fit into the working week? And there is a massive variation across the country on that. Now, we need to establish some clarity with regard to what language teaching is about. Is it about linguistic competence? Is it about having fluent expert speakers? Because that needs particular pathways and particular funding on the ground. But there is the other part of learning languages, which is about cultural awareness. It's about understanding, giving an appreciation of your own language. So the purpose and function of language teaching has to be clearly understood so that we get this right. We also need the planning so that we avoid the inconsistencies in terms of access. We need a quality of provision. Now, as I say in the paper, that doesn't mean uniformity of provision. That's perhaps a mistake that we've made in the past. But we do need a quality of provision. And I really do think that the report and the recommendations is a springboard for something. And I do understand the frustration of the committee when it comes down to actually matching that ambition with a price tag. And I'm not surprised, I'm not the only one, not to fall into the trap of giving you a figure today. But there are serious issues here. We have to drive this forward. I think I speak for my colleagues as well, that we all welcome this. And at the very least, if we can stop the decline and begin to build on something in the next couple of years, I think we would all be delighted with that outcome. Can I just say one more thing about the point that you make about the multicultural, the diverse aspect as well? I don't think we should fall into the trap. I mean, there are different scenarios out there. If I go to my friends in the Northeast who work in the oil industry, you see that wonderful, optimistic, shiny, bright, international companies bringing people from all parts of the world, and it's built on economic success. But we also have schools in Govan Hill where you have that pattern of migration that we're going to have to live with and address. And there are wonderful opportunities and challenges in Govan Hill and Glasgow as well, but they are of a significantly different nature, qualitatively different nature than the scenarios that we see in the northeast of Scotland as well. And I think in terms of social cohesion, I think in terms of agency working, addressing the issues of poverty and migration that we witnessed there as well, I think that a coherent language policy has to build in consideration of that as well. And that's why I make the point in the paper with regard to that.
May I, Chair? Yes. Yeah, thank you very much for that contribution. I agree with the vast majority of what you've said. No problems with that. No problems with that. No, I also accept the fact that you're not in a position to put up a price tag on, and I can understand why.
I'll certainly take that consideration.
Yeah, but the fact that you've so kindly agreed to support us in trying to put some figures together would be very, very helpful. I'm also interested in having several price tags in the sense that, one, you suggest that we need to be focused on what languages we want to consider. So that's an important element, because it means that we can then focus on what resources the Scottish Government can provide to match those particular languages. And there are a number of languages which are obviously more favoured than others. So that's fine. I'm also interested to find out what the school's position is in accepting volunteers to go into their schools, how do the head teachers actually feel about that, would they be comfortable with volunteers who are perhaps not fully qualified to be engaging with languages? And also the timetabling of languages and how that would impact on the school. And last, which is the most important element, all of that is depending on which aspect the education unions and staff feel more comfortable with, what is the price tag with that, approximate price tag, that these types of informations would be very, very helpful to us.
I see on volunteers coming into school, speaking a foreign language doesn't equate with being able to teach it. So you have to be very careful in that area. You know, it is good to use these opportunities, but somebody having a second language, I have many parents in my school who are bilingual, which is great, but they would not share that. They would not be comfortable.
No,
so you've got to be very careful with that.
That's exactly what I'm looking for, is what's the opinion in the
I think it depends on that person's individual skills as well, the other skills that they hold.
Do you know where I'm going with this?
Yes, it's certainly, and I mean, I think there's a lot of good work done with volunteers already. I mean, in primary schools, particularly with the promotion of community languages, in terms of promoting cultural awareness. I mean, head teachers will deploy that facility to have volunteers in. But I must say that some of the claims that are made around dynamism, goodwill, creativity, etc., these are limited. These are important. The British Council, for example, do lots of very good formal work promoting some really important, significant initiatives in schools, a bit of seed support and seed funding there as well. But that kind of contribution, marginal contribution, cannot deliver and sustain the ambitions of a policy of this kind. The point made by my colleague here with regard to the importance of teaching and learning, the methodology, the pedagogy that's involved in this, is extremely important as well. And you also made reference to 3 to 18. I made reference to the removal of foreign language assistants across the country. But we're also having the removal of teachers from pre-5 schools. I mean, Glasgow has just announced 21 nursery class teachers to be removed. Now, there is some consideration. There is some consideration with regard to very early introduction to modern languages, because it promotes a base understanding of the language and also increases motivation. I think that evidence is fairly sound. But if we're going to commit to a project like this, we really do need teachers to deliver it. You would expect me to say this, but the role of the teacher as expert in terms of delivering the necessary pedagogy, methodology, and taking this forward, I think has got to be critical. So there is a room for volunteers, there are a room for other organisations, but at the end of the day, we have to win the hearts and minds of the teachers in the school who at the end of the day are going to deliver this.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, I think moving on to another topic, Claire Adamson.
Yes, it's touched on some of the areas in this question, but as you mentioned, the British Council. We also took evidence from Le Français en Écosse, who were talking about how there are as many primary schools in Paris as there are in the whole of Scotland. So there's a huge opportunity there to actually take advantage of things like the Connecting Classrooms funding. So it's really to ask you, do you think we're making enough of the EU funding that's available? Is there enough engagement with the Comenius programmes and similar programmes? And have you experienced barriers in actually being able to take those initiatives forward?
Answer that, at least in part. I think we don't access the Comenius funding as much as we could, and I don't think all teachers are aware of it. I spent 10 weeks last term before Christmas, doing a French Institute course in Edinburgh for primary teachers' classroom work. And we covered inability from those who had not one word of French, but were going back into the classroom the following day to teach what they had been taught the night before, and which I have to say filled me with abject horror, to the other end of the scale where I have university French and I've done a local council MLPS equivalent. Nothing like the MLPS proper course, but better than nothing, and with the French I already had, adequate. People sitting there talking knew nothing about Comenius. They knew nothing about Français en Écosse. They didn't know about the immersion programmes. And I think there is a place for those to be advertised more widely, to make people very much aware that funding is available through the British Council, that there would be no cost to them. Where you hit a problem is in the timing of these things. The email that came out last week about immersion courses for October shows dates that are all term dates for us. Now, previously, I believe these have taken place during holidays. So people could use a week of their holidays and claim it as their CPD, obviously. They're during term time for some people, maybe not everyone. If you can't get cover and release, you can't go. And that in itself has an impact. The supply issue has a major impact there. And also the ability of people going on these courses. It was quite frightening to sit in a course with people who had not one word of French, none, and the other end of the scale, and know that they were going back into the classroom the next day to deliver precisely what had been taught to them. And I think those sort of individuals, immersion courses, are not probably at that point appropriate for. You need to build before you can access them.
Yeah, in terms of have there been barriers to taking up some of the initiatives connecting classrooms, I think far too often it depends on the initiative of either a particular head teacher or a particular individual who's embarking on some kind of project. And these opportunities, combined with new technology, new forms of communication, are clearly fantastic opportunities. But teachers need to be motivated, and they also need to have the skills in order to take this forward. And what they also need is they need to work in a context where leadership has been clearly shown by the head teacher right up to director of education level. That's the problem. What we saw in the wake, what we saw in the wake of the removal in secondary schools from a language being a core part of the curriculum to simply being an entitlement. Now, I know it wasn't the intention, but that downgraded languages within secondary schools. And we actually have a pattern at the moment where more pupils are being denied education and language in secondary schools, but there is some evidence that it's been maintained and even increased in primary schools to some degree. Now, that was perhaps an unintended consequence of moving to an entitlement rather than making it a compulsory element. I think we have to examine why there was a move to an entitlement away from it being core. And we also have to understand why it led to a diminishing of the place of languages in the secondary curriculum, because I don't think that was the intended consequence. I think what the move from core to entitlement was trying to address is what I was suggesting earlier on, that we teach language for different reasons. And quite clearly when it was core and you had a very uniform approach to delivering languages. I mean, I taught in departments where if it was a certain day, you're on page 57 of the book. It was a certain practice that endured in schools, unfortunately, for a while. But the point was, you were getting to the stage where perhaps you were obliging children to teach languages that they weren't enjoying, that they weren't motivated to do. So there were reasons to move away from the core to make it an entitlement. But unfortunately, that had unintended consequences. And in a period of cost-cutting, and in a period where you actually have ever-increasing demands on the curriculum, it may be a facility, a wrong solution, simply to compromise the place of languages in the curriculum. So the good thing, the upbeat thing about this project is that we're beginning to look at this afresh, the role of languages in the curriculum. And it is a big opportunity to stop the rot and actually to build a base for the future. And I'm not being pessimistic, I am being realistic. if we get progress, if we achieve progress from this, from these recommendations, I think that will be a fantastic thing. The better the progress, the more sophisticated the progress, the better resourced it is, the happier I will be. But at least I do applaud, I do welcome this initiative, because it does begin to focus on a very, very important part of the curriculum in education for our young children. But we have to be aware of the competing demands out there, and you will be aware of that yourself in terms of science and technical and engineering, etc., not to mention health and well-being, not to mention all the other aspects of the curriculum. And as I said before, that is the single biggest concern that's been identified in the Skills survey with regard to where does the time come from. Is it 1 hour a week for languages? Is it 3 hours a week for languages? Is it 4 hours a week for languages? Is it a daily? And I will also bet that no one has put a figure on what's absolutely necessary there either. And I will also promise to take that question away with my colleagues and come back with perhaps more informed opinion with regard to that. Because I think these issues, I think these questions are extremely important. And we have to move forward with clarity. That clarity is going to produce the best possible outcome and the best value for money in that respect.
Campbell?
To move on slightly to the question of language qualification. Should all future primary school teachers have a language qualification, and indeed at what level? Thoughts from the panel on that?
Our view would have to be that primary teachers are excuse me, trained generalists and should remain as such. Making a modern foreign language an absolute necessity for a teacher to enter training is adding further to the qualification barrier. Not everyone is a linguist. Not everyone is a scientist. If you're going to go down the route of every primary school teacher should have a higher in French, German, Spanish, Mandarin, whatever languages you choose, it doesn't mean that they're either inclined to teach the subject, interested in teaching the subject, or able to teach the subject. And personally, our view is very much that primary teachers should remain generalists. If having a qualification in a modern foreign languages allows them a small amount of work in the classroom on basic, general, everyday things, then fair and well. But beyond that, we wouldn't be looking for, we as a union wouldn't be looking for anything more substantial than that.
We debated it quite at length because we can understand the barriers that would come from having, you know, the number of people that would want to have or achieve the higher. But for the immersion way of delivering a modern language, you would need every teacher to have a basis. So it becomes quite a debate, but I think you would stop an awful lot of young people that are talented and very gifted teachers, skilled at teaching, that maybe not skilled at languages. So I think there needs to be a balance within it. I think there should be an opportunity, though, within their training to pick that up as well during their initial teacher education. It was my belief that I did the MLPS, that there would be people coming through into the schools with a language. I've never yet met a probationer who has come with having done a language within their training. And I think it's probably at various levels it should be offered, so that you're not sitting with a situation of one person in a school. That's where, you know, the house of cards falls, really. If you've only got one person trained in a school, they move on and you're lost with it. So I think there needs to be a sort of quite an open approach to the qualification, because it caused quite a challenge for many a person. I've got a number of excellent teachers who couldn't get into teaching for a couple of years because they didn't have that standard grade maths. But they're excellent practitioners. So it does put quite a barrier when you put a must-have on it.
There are also some residential qualifications associated with higher level, for example, degree teaching qualifications, and like 3 months residence in the country of the language. That may be a tall order to match, and I think it's also true that not everyone can be a linguist. Primary teachers are trained generalists, but nevertheless, there has always been the room for specialisms in primary education. For example, primary teachers deliver PE, music, art, modern languages, and not every single primary teacher has the same level of proficiency across all these specialisms. So there quite clearly is room to have primary teachers specialise in certain areas over others. And I think that's actually the de facto position at the moment. And there's no reason why that can't be the case with modern languages as well. And I think there probably is a case for languages becoming core as part of initial teacher education. Now, how that will be assessed at the end of the day, I think there has got to be some care in coming to conclusions there. But obviously that could be for discussion with the universities and further discussion with the trade unions. But I think there is a role there for teachers. And as I said earlier on, with the GTCS as well, with regard to its professional recognition procedures, where people can opt for professional development in particular areas to build their capacity, to build their professional development in a particular area, would obviously allow for that blended provision as well. Because primary schools are quite small units. And we've already heard that teachers do get ill, teachers do go absent. And if the teacher who is the sole provider or the sole provision in that primary school goes absent, the children are missing out. And that would be a flaw in any policy. So what you need is, as I said, that kind of blended provision where people are confident and able to take forward the language agenda. But I think you also need specialists, whether they be on site, whether they be visiting specialists, and you need that external support structure as well. Because if we're going to commit to a policy of this kind, we have to be clear that there is that critical mass of provision that ensures that all children get a fair deal when it comes to access.
Okay, thank you. Perhaps I could just move on to the question of resource sharing. We've already seen examples of this in the schools that we've visited, or that I visited as part of this inquiry, in rural areas in particular. Was a local primary school which was sharing a Mandarin teacher from the high school in a nearby town, and one of the resident teachers at the primary school admitted to learning Mandarin at the same time and level as the pupils, so they were trying to piggyback on that. Perhaps you could just say a little bit more about how resources could be shared, and also, I think in your submission, Mrs. Gray, you talk about central support being needed to ensure that primary schools are not left scrabbling about. Could you perhaps explain how that's supposed to work?
Historically, within cluster areas, secondary schools have provided support to their feeder primary schools by allowing or funding a secondary fully qualified specialist languages teacher to visit primary schools on a regular basis. I can't speak for all of Scotland, but I know that there are numerous local authorities where the funding for that has been withdrawn. It's gone. And so the secondaries no longer have the funding to cover the cost of their staff visiting and providing support and resources to the primary sector. So in that respect, there is no longer the same sharing of resources as there used to be. You will also find that there is very patchy use of different materials. So if you go from school to school, you will find them using entirely different resource materials. I'm talking about paper, books, teaching materials. One school will choose to use what it likes and another will use something else, unless the local authority has at some point put in the provision and made a determination that this is what we as a local authority will do. Where I work, we do have that. We have a modern languages programme from primary 4 up to primary 7, although I deliver French in primary 1, 2, 3 as well, every week. And if I'm off sick, they don't get it. So there is an issue. And the blended provision that was spoken about is absolutely essential to make it work. In terms of staffing resources,
there is quite capacity for sharing resources. You said at the present time some secondary schools just don't have the funding, so we're back a bit like the foreign language assistants, saying they're useful, but at the present time if the funding's withdrawn, their use is not being at the maximum, obtained to the maximum level.
you can share the resources if you have the funding to do that, but it can fall apart. It can fall apart at certain times of the year when the secondary school finds itself under particular pressure. If a modern foreign languages teacher in the secondary is off ill and whoever does the primary cover is required to fill and cover their classes, particularly if they're certificate classes, that you can understand that taking priority. It's a bit like a house of cards, and you take one away and the whole thing can collapse.
Do you believe that kind of utilising and enhancing the resources available, subject to funding, is the better way forward, rather than committing a whole load of new funding and new approaches?
I'd have to think about that one.
Okay, one final small question, just in terms of special needs children. I think your written evidence suggests not enough thought has been given to that. Would you like to say a bit more about that?
Children with special needs need special provision, and not every child who has special needs will cope with the introduction of one modern foreign language, let alone 2. And I know where I work currently, there are at least 2 pupils who are primary 7s who do not do French. They don't partake in the French classes simply because they are not in a position to do so. And we need to look at the equality impact and determine how we address the situation. It is unfair to exclude children from doing modern foreign languages if they can cope with it. And I have a daughter who has a higher in French despite being dyslexic. But not every child with special needs will be appropriate to a modern foreign languages setting.
Can I say on the sharing, we work very closely with it in our cluster basis, in our authority, that is an approach. But one of the things that we've done to overcome the fact of staff being able to visit the primary is the use of GLOW. We've done quite a lot of GLOW meets. It doesn't replace a visit, but it does allow for the secondary to speak to 7 primaries. And we use that quite heavily with a project that we do in our whole cluster around our French.
Do you find that easy to use? Because I certainly recall when I visited some schools, they found GLOW quite difficult.
You've always got good technical people. If you've got good technical people, it can be reasonable. We've had more success than failures with it, but I think it's about the preparation and it's about having the IT skills. And I suppose that depends establishment to establishment.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yes, I mean, the argument about utilising present resources is logistically absolutely necessary, and I did actually make reference to the fact that there will be many teachers out there, some of them perhaps in promoted positions now, who are more involved in management and administration, who will have the language skills and qualifications, and they are not being deployed. There will be people who have come through the Modern Languages Primary Schools project who have been trained in certain languages, and that has become dormant over a number of years. Now, quite clearly, we may have to go out there and identify these people, give them some professional development, give them some encouragement to take up the teaching of languages again. But that in itself takes planning and takes resources as well. The other problem with sharing resources as well, you mentioned Mandarin there. Now, it's very, very fashionable to talk about Mandarin. China, emerging country, powerful. But so was Russia 20 years ago. And Russia used to talk about Russian. Russian has virtually disappeared from schools just now. And I think the reality is, I make this point in my paper, is that most teachers are trained in French. French is still a major European language. Spanish is a world language. But I don't think we will be able to avoid the fact that French will still be the main first language, because that is the biggest resource that we have. And we do need some commonality. I mean, I spoke about equality of provision as opposed to uniformity. But we do need some commonality if we're going to manage transition properly in terms of the first language. Where we can have real diversity in terms of what is available locally or what people can aspire to is with the second language. And I think the second language is an ambition, despite everything I've said about resources and practicalities, all the rest of it. I think the argument about introducing a second language is something that we should not lose sight of. But we must keep in mind that not everyone is going to be a fluent speaker of another language. And the point of introducing a second language, I think, has got to be considered carefully in terms of the purpose and function of what is intended, what the aim is there. But I don't think we can get away from the fact that French is the biggest resource out there. And if there is a commonality of resource, we can certainly share it much more effectively, practically. Because for all the schemes in the world, if you don't have the teacher, or if you're trying to organise transition, if you go up to your local school, that's what you're going to get, that's what's going to be available. There's been lots of sharing resources, lots of secondary teachers during the MLPS project went into primary schools. But the fact is, as we know, everybody is now timetabled up to the hilt. Head teachers don't have that facility to allow that kind of release, and neither do directors of education at present. And we come back to that issue of resources. It's not all about resources, of course it's not. It's about resource sharing. It's about imaginative approaches. It's about other organisations feeding in, like the British Council. But at the end of the day, without resources, there's very little we can do.
Can I follow on from that just briefly? I think Hugh's absolutely right. We need to have an agreed, this is where we go, this is what the language we are teaching as foreign language 1. I spent a year and a bit on day release learning German and undergoing the MLPS German course, and I loved it, and I went back into school and I used it for 1 year. Now, what is the funding cost of sending someone like myself a day out a week, 40 weeks, to use it for 1 year in class and then never use it again because German as a language was dropped, was ditched? At school, and I wish it was just 20 years ago, but 40 years ago, I studied Russian. Говорите вы по-русски? Я говорю по-русски. It's very useful and it's nice to be able to do little bits. But it was, as you said, the language of the time. And I studied it, but it's not any use anymore other than to entertain the children and to show them how to write in Cyrillic and so on and so forth. If you have commonality, if you say modern foreign language 1 is going to be French or Spanish or whatever, then at least you know where you stand. And you know when you train people that you'll be able to use that. And it won't matter whether they're working in Shetland or the borders, Western Isles or West Lothian. It will be the same language. Maybe different physical resources, but the same language being taught. And I think that's absolutely imperative.
Just one last point. Sharing resources. You mentioned ICT online and GLO's been mentioned.
Yeah.
The technology is improving every day and there is massive opportunity there to deploy that much more effectively. But I must say there is a fallacy there. Many people think that online provision is a cheap option. There is not. There is a particular pedagogy to actually using online, to educating people online. And the idea that you just sit children in front of a screen or a smart board and that's the end of the story is a major fallacy, and I would like to think we would avoid that. But nevertheless, the British Council actually connected classrooms the way that they use technology and promote effective pedagogy using that is a useful model. But this idea that somehow something online is a cheap option, I think is a major fallacy and one a trap I think I would hope that we would avoid.
Certainly.
I don't know anybody that says that, you know, sitting in front of a screen is a cheap option. I've never heard that. The glow experience from my early days with learning and teaching Scotland, and we're going to hear from somebody from Education Scotland next. I think we're fully aware of the implications of bringing in technology to learning and teaching and so on, and I think that's well understood and has been for a number of years. The chink of light that I did hear there, I think, really was quite encouraging there about glow and its potential. I think it started off with a bright prospect of a bright future, and it had some teething problems in its initial years, and it can always improve, but I think the opportunity that it presents there, Mrs Purves mentioned the power of it, and I hope to ask some questions in the next panel about it, I think are really quite exciting and can be deployed even more effectively in this setting, convener, when we're talking about modern languages, to bring that kind of online richness of experience to the children. So I don't think anybody thinks it's a fallacy and it's a cheap option to just sit kids in front of a screen. I think that idea went out years ago, frankly.
Can I just pick up a point that Linda Gray had mentioned earlier about transition and about choose a language and stick to that language? And one of the concerns that has been raised with us from a number of areas, and a difference of opinion between language teachers and linguistic professors, is that you pick two languages and you stick to those right through the whole teaching, your whole teaching life or your whole learning life. And then other people are saying it doesn't matter, you know, you can have a mix of languages. So there's a bit of a difference there. But one of the challenges was about the transition from primary school to secondary school. And some of the challenges that young people had, maybe if they had been, it's been French and Spanish all the way through primary school, but they get to secondary school and they speak German and they teach German and Italian. So there's a real issue there. And I'm just wondering whether there's been any work done or you've had any experience of, you know, a bit more joined up thinking between primary school and secondary school and making that transition much more seamless and sticking to that, you know, learning maybe French from primary 1 right through to 5th or 6th year.
I certainly think where I work, because we have a very clear, this is what you will cover, this is our programme of work for primary schools in, and it predominantly is French, then that's what the secondaries know the children coming up from primary will have covered. They know the work they'll cover and they'll know the language they will have covered it in. I can't speak for any other local authority. Where I am in a slightly different position is that I'm possibly in one of the few primary schools in Scotland that actually feeds into two different local authorities. Because although it sits in one, the vast majority of our primary 7 pupils actually go to the secondary school in the neighbouring authority. For reasons of historical Lothian region type situations. So I teach the primary West Lothian curriculum to the children, but the vast majority go on to a school in Edinburgh. And that's something that I personally would like to look at, and I haven't, and that's a purely personal basis. We do need joined up thinking. I know how frustrating it was for my own children, who are now long grown, who went and one did French in primary, the other did German, and when they went to the high school, the one who'd done French got German class, and the one who had done German got a French class. So hey-ho, they've both got a little bit of each. At the end of the day, children are fairly flexible. If they like languages, if they enjoy languages, then the introduction of another language is sometimes a good experience. That said, we have to be very careful that the way we teach it and the manner in which we approach it in primary doesn't switch them off, so that when they get to secondary they think, oh, I don't have to take this after whatever year, I'm not going to. And that's an area we have to be very conscious of.
Okay, it's something we have heard other evidence on, and I think we've certainly taken note of it. We've got one very, very quick final question career prospects and disadvantages from Willie Coffey, but if you can make it extremely quick answers, because we're sort of eating into the time for the next panel, and I want to be fair to everyone. So,
it was just to get your views on the kind of the broader aspect of the impact that modern language teaching in primary could have beyond secondary and into employment, and what the importance, from your perspective, is of bringing this initiative into Scotland will be for Scottish children and their prospects and their economic future. We do have some figures from the British Council that suggest that Scotland economically is losing out because we don't have our children with these skills, and it was just to get your view and whether you agreed with that and what additionally you could offer to support the committee's deliberations.
I mean, in terms of employability, in terms of, you know, even psychologically, individually and as a nation, I think it's extremely important that we break this myth that we cannot. I mean, there is no gene that determines whether you can learn a modern language or not. Modern language learning is complex, though. At one level, it can be very, very simple, and a kind of parrot-like thing. You hear the language, and there are people with no academic qualifications who actually learn languages at a very young age, without any teachers, without anybody else. It's an instinct that we have. People are born to learn languages, but somehow we're getting it wrong. And also, I think, in terms of employability, it's absolutely critical. Now, as I said earlier on, not everyone is going to be fluent in a foreign language. But in terms of diversity, in terms of open-minded and cultural awareness, about having the confidence to go into markets where people speak languages, to have that awareness of language, not to see it as a barrier, I think is extremely important as well. We spoke about transitions there from nursery into primary, primary into secondary. They're always seen in formal educational terms as the key transition stages. There's another important transitional stage, and that is from school into the big wider world. But we've seen a diminishing of languages in both further education and higher education as well. And I think it comes back to this clarity of purpose. We need to be clear about why we're teaching languages. There's got to be a linearity in terms of building your capacity in a language, in terms of grammar, expertise, if you're going to be a fluent speaker. That needs real targeted expert input. But for everybody else, we should enjoy the idea of learning a language. So we have to have that differentiated provision. And it's about having the fluent speakers to improve employability and to take advantage of the economic challenges there as well. But it's also about breaking down the inhibitions in people to embrace the wider world, to go into markets where they may not be fluent speakers, but they're comfortable with the traditions, with the language, with their own ability to cope. Absolutely, I agree entirely.
Just PURVES?
I agree. I don't think I've got anything else to add.
Okay. Mrs. Gray?
I have no further to add. I think Hugh's answer encompasses it.
Okay, can I take this opportunity to thank you? Your evidence has been extremely helpful to the committee. We'll certainly accept the offer of the help of the EIS and maybe pinning down the cost of some of the resources. And we look forward to hearing from you. Now, the committee's still taking evidence for the next few weeks. We have our next panel coming now, and the next meeting of the committee will be a business panel, and the committee meeting after that will be the Minister. So that will allow us to inform our questions to the Minister as well, if we've got some additional information from yourself. So if I can thank you very much, you're welcome to stay to hear the evidence of the next panel. If not, then safe home. Thanks. I'll suspend just for a few seconds just to allow a change over of witnesses. Welcome back, and we will continue on with agenda item 1, and we will now hear evidence from our second panel of witnesses for our inquiry into foreign language teaching in primary schools. If I can welcome Sarah Breslin, who is the Director of Scotland's National Centre for Languages, which is fondly referred to as SILT or SKILT earlier. Fiona Pate, the HM Inspector of Education for Education Scotland, and Jim MacDonald, the Qualification Managers, Modern Languages for the Scottish Qualifications Authority. And you may have heard, obviously you have heard some of the evidence earlier, and it's a similar form of questioning, so we're going to go straight to questions to Claire Adamson.
Yeah, it's just the two first questions I had for the other panel. So the initial one is about the funding situation and whether you have done any substantive work on looking at the costings that have been suggested by the Scottish Government for rollout of following the pilot.
If I could start with that one, we haven't looked at costings ourselves. I'm afraid you'll not be surprised to hear that. But clearly at this moment in time, Scottish Government are engaging with COSLA about this and working with local authorities to look at the kind of funding that might be necessary. And I think one of the key things that the report recommended was that education authorities should do an audit of what they currently have in terms of resources, which would include trained teachers. So they could see what the full implications are for funding, and in particular also for funding post-13-14, because at the moment we've talked about some specific funding for this session, but it's also that they need to think about sustainability for future years. Certainly the working group's view that there was likely to be a need for more, but it's until there is more specific detail about the needs of local authorities, it would be possible to put a figure on that. And the other thing that would have to be taken into account would be the information that will come eventually from the implementation group about the timings and the stagings of implementation, because clearly that's bound to have an impact on the amount of funding that will be needed over a number of years. But I think one of the things that authorities are currently doing, certainly my experience of authorities, is that at the moment, as well as looking at an audit, they're looking at how they can be creative, and it's actually been very cheering to see the way authorities are looking at what they've got and looking at other ways of bringing in aspects of this. They're not saying that they won't need other things, but they're certainly looking creatively at what they've got. Authorities are looking at working together to share resources, to share training programmes, for example. They're looking at how they can use other experts in the classroom. They're looking at how they can use IT resources that they have and how they can use GLOW. So a lot of creativity is going into that, and they're also looking at some of the ideas that people have mentioned in previous reports to this committee, things like language champions, things like one person in a school linking with others and so on. So there's a lot of good stuff going on, a lot of thought going into this across the country. Yes.
You say that, many of the schools are doing good things. I mean, we just heard from the previous panel that Glasgow City Council, for example, was removing language support from nursery, primary schools. That's the biggest authority in Scotland, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of other authorities which are strapped for cash just now. And this is why it was so important to try and get a realistic figure in terms of resources. But it was more important, my view is more important, not only about resources, but what other skills or benefits we can bring to schools. And I know, well, many of the schools are uncomfortable about the idea of volunteers being used. Mm-hmm. I'm not totally convinced that if we could encourage volunteers to get themselves suitably qualified, that they couldn't be used, or retired school teachers and head teachers who had language skills. What's your opinion about that?
Again, I think I would be repeating what someone said earlier, which would be that these are a wonderful addition and a wonderful additionality to the experience that young children can have, but that volunteers are not trained teachers. They would certainly need some training to be able to work with children, but they're not trained teachers. I was asked to evaluate a project that went on last year in some East Lothian primaries using international students who went to teach some language for approximately 6 weeks in primary schools. And what came out of that very clearly was that it did wonders to encourage children to be open to learning other languages, to feel enthusiastic about it and to feel that they could succeed. But what also came out of it was that it worked. It only worked when the teacher, the class teacher and the volunteer worked together well, because the teacher was the one who had the pedagogical knowledge and the knowledge of the children and could really work with them and suggest ways of doing things, whereas the international student was the person who had the language skill, and it also relied on them linking in between lessons, for example, and deciding who was going to do what. So there's huge potential for that to make a big difference, and certainly to help in situations where you're trying to share resources, you're trying to boost resources that you already have. But that would not be a replacement for teachers trained to teach a language.
Yeah, the second question was in relation to the use of EU funds and the communities projects and the connecting classrooms, and whether you think there's more work that could be done to encourage that.
I think there is more that could be done to encourage access to these programmes. One of the things that we do as the National Centre is try and bring all of that information together into one website and to alert as many schools as possible as to the deadlines, the advantages, etc. Sometimes it's a question of no one in the school having time to fill in the paperwork. You know, there are practical issues. However, we have a partnership with the British Council, and you know there's ongoing discussions about how can you simplify the process, how can you make it more accessible. Certainly, the teachers who have gone either to France or Spain under the Comenius funding organised through the British Council, but also through Le Français en Écosse, have all come back saying what a wonderful experience it was. So yes, there's a job to be done. We're trying very hard to get that information out, to work with the British Council to find ways to simplify the information and to make sure that a school, when they're looking for what are all the options for me or for my staff, can find that information in one place. That at the moment is critical because people are under a lot of pressure and there's a lot of work going on.
And one of the things we haven't examined in that area at the moment is whether there's a geographic differences across Scotland. Are some local authorities more engaged with Comenius than others?
I don't know, because we don't look at the data centrally. That would be for the British Council to give you that information.
Okay,
Thanks very much, Convener. I'd just like to go back to the funding aspect for a moment, because obviously that's a matter of great concern for the committee. Can you tell us how many primary schools there are in the whole of Scotland?
I don't have that figure, but I could certainly get it for you.
Can you give us an estimation?
I can't, I'm afraid.
Can anyone on the panel give us an estimation of the number of primary schools?
I wouldn't be able to give that.
I don't have it with me.
It's something I should know, but I don't have with me.
So nobody therefore can then take the £4 million and then divide it by the number of schools that are in Scotland?
No,
Sorry, it would be divided by the local authority in I think in relation to the number of pupils,
yes,
would it be,
Fiona? How that would be, the individual authorities' shares of that money would be something that government would be deciding what each authority would get. You presume that would be proportionate to the number of schools that they have. And that's certainly there are challenges. Nobody is trying to say there are not challenges related to funding. Even when we were talking earlier about creative ways around that, that doesn't get away from what we mentioned about trained teachers. So yes, there are challenges there. In terms of the amount that would mean for an individual school, I couldn't say, because what you would be looking at in an authority would be how to use that money to serve several schools, as opposed to giving, I would imagine, as opposed to giving each individual school a certain amount of money, because to use that money centrally to provide something like training or to provide additional resources across the piece would probably make more financial sense and would benefit more young people than if they put it into amount of money to an individual school, where there may be one school who is in the happy circumstance of having a number of trained teachers and another who may have one or none.
We could be talking about as little as £1,500 per school across Scotland in terms of the allocation of funding to deliver this policy.
Well, again, that would be, it would be up to local authorities to decide how to use that money.
But I mean,
and
you're
whether they may
at the centre, I
individual-
mean, as the Education Inspectorate in Scotland, and you can't tell us how many schools there are in Scotland. So you're able to say to us, this policy can be delivered, but yet you can't tell us how many schools there are in Scotland.
I think what we're seeing is that until there is an audit done of provision, we wouldn't be able to say how much money is required to produce this policy.
I mean, you know that the budget is £4 million. You know that that's how much money is going to be spent on this project, but you can't divide that by the number of schools and work out what the pro rata allocation might be per school. And I'm suggesting to you, would it be unrealistic to think that could work out at £1,500 per school?
Again, it would depend on that £4 million would be divided by 32 local authorities, and they would decide how that money went, whether it went to individual schools or whether it went to a centralised training system, whatever. So therefore, just to put a figure on what would go to individual schools would be unwise of me.
I'm just very surprised that HM Inspectorate can't tell me how many schools there are in Scotland. Thanks, Convener.
I think there's 2,186 primary schools in Scotland, and I think for the pilot purposes, it's individual schools that have been chosen for the pilot purposes, so that £4 million would not be split between every primary school. It would only be split between the primary schools who are taking part in the pilot. So
there's specific funding for the pilot schools in addition to that?
In addition to the 4.2 million.
So the £4.2 million, to be clear then, will cover the whole of Scotland, but there'll be pilot money on top?
The pilot money has already been allocated, and that's for this current year, although some of the pilots are continuing into next year. You know, that was a separate pot of funding to get the pilots off the ground.
One of the clerks work out the arithmetic for us and tell us what that works out at per school, because in my sort of maths, that doesn't work out even at £1,500 per school.
I don't think it would work out evenly, to be fair. I think depending on the number of pupils that are in a school, the number of skills that are in the school, how many teachers need trained. So it's a very individualistic thing rather than, you know, an equal split between every single primary school. It would be what resources are required. And I think that's what the audit is doing. I understand that's what the audit is doing, is to try and work out what's needed and when it's needed. And I think the very helpful suggestion from the EIS earlier will help us and inform that process. And we do have the Minister with us on the 18th of April, so we can maybe direct some of those questions to the Minister and maybe move on now. I think, Willie Coffey, you want to next?
Just on that point, Convener, if you don't mind, I mean, we're not starting from scratch here. This is not just suddenly we're just deciding to bring modern languages into the primary whence nothing has been before. There's already lots of good practice going on. This initiative is an exciting initiative for Scotland, and it's going to complement and build on good work already done. We've heard that it's maybe not enough, and we've heard that message, I think, from a few contributors, Convener. But it'll be down to the authorities, really, to prioritise where they want to complement the existing initiatives that they've already got underway. So, I mean, I don't see it then as an argument of a per-school slice of the 4 million. I don't think it's really going to work out like that in practice, and we have to allow the local authorities the flexibility to determine their own needs, I think.
Helen, could you put the BlackBerry away, please?
Just doing the calculation, that's all.
Right, okay.
Doing the maths.
Just moving on to another topic, and it's maybe a question for SQA. Given that we had some evidence earlier about declining languages and maybe further in higher education and some of the challenges that local authorities are experiencing with language assistance and high schools, I'm just wondering maybe what kind of work the SQA are doing to encourage young people to take up languages, and maybe, I don't know whether your involvement in initial teacher education can maybe give us an insight into what's proposed for teachers learning.
We don't actually have a remit in initial teacher education, and obviously we don't have a remit in primary education, but we are committed as an organisation to the Modern Languages Agenda, and I think what we're looking at is a diversification of these types of qualifications that are on offer, especially with the new qualifications that are coming in under CFE. So we have a range of national courses, and national courses are certificated normally to examination level. They include an examination. But as well as our national qualifications, we're diversifying our range of products in terms of the qualifications we have, and we're currently introducing a new award at SCQF level 3 and 4, which is roughly equated to standard grade Foundation General. It's an entry type qualification, and that's Modern Languages for Life and Work. And that's a qualification that can be taken in the senior phase, but also has a possibility for being taken before the senior phase. And one of the key aspects of that award is that it can be taken in more than one language, and it also includes a unit which is called Building on Employability Skills, which is a key component of it. And that's a sort of departure for us in the languages sphere, and that we are having a greater focus on a range of different types of skills that can be brought into a languages qualification.
Yes, do you think that the final question that my colleague Willie Coffey asked the last panel about teaching young people not so much, you know, fluency, but competence and confidence in a language to boost their economic, opportunities? Is that a direct input into that process? Was that mindful of that?
Yes, absolutely, because what we're looking at in the Languages for Life and Work Award is to deliver a communicative competency, but also to contextualise languages within a context basically that allows young people to see that they are useful. They're useful in an employment setting, and by using the language, they're also building their employability skills. And we think that that's a key aspect that languages can deliver.
Can you tell us then the uptake of that across Scotland? Have you any idea?
This is a new award, and it's under the aegis of the Curriculum for Excellence developments. But the forerunner of that has been an award, a single skill unit called Languages for Work Purposes that we've developed in the last 3 or 4 years. And the uptake, and we have that delivered in a range of languages, and the uptake has been growing steadily. And where there is uptake, it has been very successful in schools. And actually, SQ has actually developed an action research project in one centre that has developed and which has run the award very successfully. And it was really that sort of work and that sort of research done into what was happening in schools that led us to develop that single unit into the award. And the award comprises 3 units, as I was saying. It comprises the Languages for Work Purposes, a new unit called Languages for Life, and the key, the meshing element is the Building on Employability Skills.
Okay, you might be able to help us then in the committee, given that some of the evidence we have heard about, you know, choosing maybe 1, 2 or 3 specific languages to teach from primary 1, primary 5 and then through to high school. The range of languages that are available in that award, did you limit those to specific sets?
Yeah, there are 10 languages available at the moment, okay. But because the units in which the award are based are generic, we would have the option to expand the range of languages because of the generic nature of the units.
I think Hanzala was wanting to quickly, and then Claire.
Yes. One of the questions I wanted to ask was, when you're talking about deciding on languages, what is the criteria? Because one of the issues that I'm currently facing from constituents in Glasgow is that Punjabi and Urdu are a growing demand. Now, I know we recognize Urdu and we do exams for it, but we don't do it for Punjabi, even though it's widely spoken. In fact, it's the second largest language spoken in Scotland today. Why is that not on your list?
Obviously, we have to take a view, and we have to look at things in review. For instance, in terms of Punjabi, I think in 2008 or 2009, SQ did conduct a survey into the provision of Urdu, or the potential for qualifications in Urdu, or not specifically national courses in Urdu. I think it was felt at that time that, given the experience in south of the border in England and with awarding bodies there and the uptake levels, I think we were minded to not develop a national course in Punjabi because we did not think it would be sustainable. However, obviously we keep everything in review, and we will look at any impacts of any developments in the modern languages in the primary school which might impact on that in the medium term. The closest, I suppose, the closest parallel we've got at the moment is the development work that we've done in the last 3 or 4 years in introducing from scratch national courses in Chinese languages, in Mandarin and Cantonese. And obviously there were particular drivers for that. There was the Scotland Stronger Engagement with China plan that was around 2006. the first point of 10 points was there will be national qualifications in Chinese. And obviously we had to act on that, and we were glad to. But obviously that was a significant driver, and it was fully funded. It was directly funded, and obviously there would be implications for the development of future qualifications and national courses in terms of the sort of funding streams that would be available for that.
Thank you.
Slightly along the same lines as my colleague Gonzala, we have seen that there are a multitude of languages, second languages, across Scotland in our primary and secondary schools, and with Polish being another one of the ones that's very prevalent at the moment. And I was wondering if there had been any investigation into a qualification that would be flexible enough to recognise a second language for a student, you know, without it necessarily being a taught language within the context of the school.
Well, we have, I mean, in terms of our languages for work purposes units and our new award, Languages for Life and Work, Polish is one of the 10 languages included there. And I spoke to a committee at the Parliament last year about the provision in Polish, and at that stage we were also minded to make sure that we included Polish as one of the 10 languages in the suite of languages that we have for Languages for Life and Work.
But it will be limited to those 10. There's no opportunities for students from other.
As I say, that there may be opportunities, but we have to take a view on how sustainable what we would call the surround us and the support to the qualification. So we may have instances where we have to make sure that there is provision in terms of teaching people who are qualified to act as verifiers, to act as in the sort of quality assurance aspects that we have in the qualifications, and that's not always discernible.
That's great, thank you.
Okay, I think, Willie Coffey, you've got a question about GLOW and other technology.
Yes, sure, yep. I wonder if I could just talk a wee bit about GLOW. It was mentioned earlier by the previous panel and previous contributors, convener to this committee's consideration of this matter. I don't expect, Fiona, you might have a great deal of exposure to GLOW over the years, but it does offer a really exciting potential, I think, to engage in this particular subject. So I would just like to ask you, and perhaps other colleagues, what kind of plans and preparations are you making at the moment to use that kind of technology to assist with this initiative for Scottish school children?
At the moment, GLOW is actually undergoing a major reform to make it easier to use, which will be good news to those who have not found it as easy as we would have hoped. So, first of all, from the technical side, there should be a big improvement there. But second, in terms of how GLOW is used, already one of the pilot schools, a primary school in Dundee, is making really good use of GLOW to link the learning that they're getting through the pilot and the training and so on with other schools in Dundee. So you have got, as GILLIAN PURVES mentioned earlier, things like GLOW meets, things like sharing with other schools happening. In addition to that, things like teachers GLOW meets, you've got children linking through GLOW as well to share their learning, and there's huge scope to expand that, in particular if you're thinking about areas which are more rural, for example. It's a way of them linking with other schools. In addition to that, we have obviously resources which have been put onto GLOW as well to support all languages. Specific resources produced by Education Scotland, but other resources that are now on there and that are available for sharing. And the more online resources appear, and I think absolutely correct, someone said that's not, you don't put someone in front of a computer or something else and expect them to learn a language, but there are many interactive resources that can be used with the teacher to engage children more in learning, and we're seeing more and more of that, more resources being produced both commercially and ourselves. For example, Education Scotland worked with Richard Talleyrand just last year to produce a major resource for primary schools, which has been very much welcomed. It's for upper primary at the moment, so obviously there's scope to look at things for further down in primary schools. But huge potential there, and people are really beginning to tap into that.
If I could just come in there, I think it's about GLOW, but it's about technology and social media. You know, it's wider than just GLOW. As an organisation that develops professional learning for teachers, we do use GLOW, and I have one of my staff members who's currently working on a programme of GLOW Meets to support primary teachers delivering modern languages. She has said that, you know, the changes in the technology, it is much, much easier to use and has been very, very successful. We also are obviously part of a university, and the BEd students themselves have their own way of interacting through social media, and information goes out via Twitter, and that they're engaged in that kind of learning. So as Fiona said, there is huge potential in the specific area of Chinese. We have uploaded onto our website a number of resources that people can download and use, and they're all very, very interactive. And for primary, having online resources which will give primary teachers the correct pronunciation, which is of a huge concern for them. You know, there is a lack of confidence there, so they have that backup. So yes, there is huge potential, and I think across the board we're looking at ways of developing it further. But the teachers who are coming through current training are so IT literate, and for them this is just part and parcel of daily life. And I think we should be positive, because they will bring all of that knowledge to bear in the classroom in future years.
And so are pupils.
Yes.
Far more computer literate than many of the teachers are.
I'm absolutely delighted to hear this, and of course as somebody who worked for Learning and Teaching Scotland for so many years, when GLOW was, I think really it was ahead of its time, really, and perhaps technically, if the truth be told as well, convener, ahead of its time, but its time I think has come. I wanted to ask you though, with the technical limitations apart, is it intended that we can get access to GLOW and the materials from home for the children and their parents to be able to interact with the environment? Because I think that theme has run through several of the committee meetings before, as to how to engage our parents with their children and their ability to learn and interact with modern languages. So will GLOW be extended, or is it possible at the moment to allow access from the home for children and their parents?
Yes, that's certainly been looked at, and there are schools which are currently using IT. For example, they put, and a number of schools put really interesting homework, extra things on their own website, but the use of GLOW at home is something that, yes, we'd be looking to have in place, fully in place, we say.
Super, thank you.
It is open. The one thing at the moment that people have said that it is, of course, a national resource, and therefore there isn't the ability at the moment to link with other countries, but that can be done by other means.
Great, thank you.
Hey, hands up.
Thank you, Convener. I was just wondering if the panel would want to share an opinion with me, and that is that, would it be helpful if we had a national curricula which was rolled out to the whole of Scotland, so every school was on the same period, on the same day, and would that support better learning and actually using IT equipment to support the school and staff, particularly looking at languages and other topics in terms of education? I mean, one of the things that state schools have always been charged with is that not being able to teach general knowledge education, whereas private schools tend to do reasonably well in that. And I'm just wondering if we were all on the same hymn sheet at the same time, at the same day, giving a larger range of subjects on IT, would that actually be beneficial, and should we consider going down that route?
I would suggest not. I think one of the strengths of the Scottish curriculum, in particular as Curriculum for Excellence, is the flexibility and the fact that it can be responsive to local needs, to the needs of schools which are in rural communities and in city schools. What it does say is that there are certain elements that should be in a broad general education, and the experiences and outcomes give the curriculum. So therefore, all children are entitled to these, but the ways in which these are addressed and placed on the curriculum would be up to local authorities and to schools, and I think that is a strength that we have. I think one of the things that was mentioned earlier about languages and languages falling out of favour, if you like, is the important role of promoting languages and being very positive about languages and about the benefits of them, and making sure that that's something that's translated into positivity in individual schools and head teachers, that they see a place in it and that therefore it's promoted in schools. In terms of a national curriculum. I suspect you may be suggesting there as well, identifying the languages. Identifying the languages as well. In terms of the language that's studied, we've mentioned already that there's a huge resource in French. Whichever language a child is studying gives them specific skills that are worthwhile both now and in later life. When you go further along in terms of seeking employment, they get the skills, the predispositions to learning a language, to feeling that they can be successful, and that's one of the key things you would hope they would get out of learning a language in primary school, is a sense of confidence that they can do this, and an interest in other cultures as well, which is obviously important further down the line too. So in terms of which language, in that sense, they will get those same skills which will benefit them. What is important is that you look at the practicalities in there of local needs of languages. For example, we have one pilot school in Shetland which is interested in introducing Norwegian as another language because of the contacts that they have and so on there. And that's very specific to them. But you have to look at local resources, meaning the trained teachers that you have and the languages they can offer. And another key thing, certainly which languages can offer qualifications later, but also progression and transition, and that was mentioned today, and that's extremely important that there is that progression, because when you're looking at what this policy is trying to do, someone said, what are the objectives? And I think they're twofold. The one is that there will be this language, the first modern language, if you like, that is going to be there for progression and studied in depth, competence and confidence that you're hoping will be followed through by following that same language right the way through the broad general education, so that they can use that language flexibly. But the second language, the other focus that's there is on young people having this exposure to languages and to other cultures. And in terms of the second modern language that we're talking about introducing at some point in primary and also at some point in secondary, that's one where you're talking about this skills building, about seeing another culture, building confidence in another language. So to that one, the progression is not what's being looked for in this report. So you're looking for two things, dual things out of this report, which should make people feel more comfortable about it. You're still promoting progression and depth in one, but you're also bringing in an openness. I think it's an openness to other cultures. When you speak to children in primary schools who are really enjoying that experience, they want to learn more languages because they don't see that as a barrier and because they're actually enjoying it.
I just want to come back on that for a minute. And that was, whilst I understand what you're saying in terms of, you're suggesting there may be limitations in that, I'm suggesting the other. I'm saying that with technology, every school could actually home into whatever topic or subject they wanted to at any given time. So if the Education Authority Scotland had puts together a package, then different clusters can type and go into different languages at the same time. So there would say, for example, that you could have two schools and two different clusters, one learning French and one learning German at the same time of the day. So that capability is available, and I'm just exploring that possibility because we have identified that there are large gaps in Scotland in terms of language skill at the moment. And I'm just wondering, would that be an additional support for the teachers in the classroom where they could tap into a resource?
It would be if it were flexible. I think the notion of doing it at a specific time each day might be inhibiting for some schools. And also the fact that what we're looking at now, as opposed to the previous model where children had an hour of language once a week, you're looking at trying to build that into the school day with things like, simple things like registration, dates and so on being done in the modern language, but also building in little and more often, which would make that that model more complicated. But I can see a value in having some resources that are available for schools to use as and when it's appropriate to them, yes.
If I could come back on that one, if we take the example of Mandarin teaching in secondary schools, there are local authorities where there are perhaps 3 or 4 secondary schools within a reasonable distance who have timetabled Mandarin at the same time in order to facilitate that sharing of resources. So it can work in certain circumstances, and again it fits into the whole notion of pooling resources and working together. but we really do need to maintain the flexibility as well.
And I think there also have been neighbourhood agreements that have worked quite well, and certainly we see presentations from candidates at SQA who are presented by another centre, and those arrangements can work well, but they have to be well managed.
Yeah, that's helpful.
Claire Adamson.
Yeah, it's a quick question because I also sit in the Education and Culture Committee, and we have looked at some of the usage of GLOW in that committee too, albeit at the start of the session. But one of my concerns about it is when you look at the parental login statistics for GLOW, which I don't think are still being produced, but they were being produced at one point, and it shows that East Renfrewshire had a very, very high parental logon, as you might expect from an authority that certainly in terms of qualifications is one of the highest performing in Scotland, but I live in North Lanarkshire, my son's in North Lanarkshire, and the logins for parents is much lower there. And don't expect an answer today, but would it be possible to have some monitoring figures of GLOW logins across the country to give us that kind of geographic spread of how it's been used?
I can certainly take that back as a very positive suggestion. Thank you.
Okay, Rod Campbell.
Yeah, and I just wondered if you had any thoughts on the question of the level of qualification which is appropriate for primary school teachers, the debate we were having with the first panel, and also on the use of foreign language assistants. Any thoughts you'd share with us?
In terms of the qualifications of languages teachers, obviously the GTC is looking at the notion of a possible hire as an entrance there. Whatever qualification level is looked at finally, I don't think it's unreasonable to suggest that there should be some form of qualification that teachers might have on entry to their initial teacher education. But certainly what is the most important thing is that they have some input on language learning and language during their initial teacher education, so that although they are generalists mean that's generalists with a lot of things, and modern languages are part of that general teaching that they will be expected to do. And the only way that this is going to work is if you have got a body, all teachers are able to deliver some form of language further down the line. That's not going to happen tomorrow, obviously, which is why we're looking at interim methods for training just now. But certainly input during the initial teacher education is a very important thing for two reasons. One, to give that knowledge, but also to give the confidence. And I think that's probably the most important thing of all, to give the confidence that they feel they can use the language. But in addition to that, other support is very important. We've talked about support from some from visiting specialists at one point. It may not be that they're coming in to teach, but they're there as a support mechanism for teachers. That kind of support is very important. And in terms of foreign language assistants, they can be a huge support, both in terms of the pronunciation that they have, the cultural input that they have. And often, when you have foreign language assistants in schools, it's very rare to have a foreign language assistant who's assigned to only one school. That assistant tends to be a resource that is shared, so that a lot can be gained from having one foreign language assistant. So on two counts there, that would also support teachers in primary schools, for example. There's the possibility of doing that, as well as giving that additionality to the secondary curriculum.
And if I could perhaps come in on that, interestingly enough, we have, within SILT, we have organised a 3-day introduction to French for the fourth year BEd students, just as an extra. And the message was tweeted across the community, and the places were filled within literally 20 minutes. So I think that shows that future primary teachers are keen to get involved, and they recognise that languages are very important. We were absolutely delighted at the response, and we hope that over the coming years this is something we might be able to roll out more frequently. In terms of foreign language assistants, we are the organisation who train the foreign language assistants, who provide them with ideas and support, because many foreign language assistants are not teachers and maybe not even intending to become teachers. So they need support as to how to work in schools. And over the last couple of years, one of my colleagues has been looking at a project-based approach to using foreign language assistance, and a lot of that has involved going down and supporting the primary, and those projects have been very powerful, and I think the impact has been felt right across that learning community. So they're an excellent resource, but because they are not teachers, they require support, so that we make sure that they're deployed in the best possible way.
Okay, we've heard some evidence that they represent good value for money for foreign language assistance. Would you agree with that as a panel?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Good. Thank you.
Helen Eady.
Thank you very much, Convener. You've told us this morning already that the pilot programmes are underway just now and that the 4 million will be for the rollout. Can you tell us what the pilot programmes will actually, the cost of that is? But can you also tell us, can anyone give us an initial report as to how that's actually progressing? And in terms of the embedding of the language in the curricula, how's that working as well?
You're heavily involved in that. Perhaps, Sarah, you'd like to start that?
Okay. £120,000 has been put aside for 10 pilots this year, and those pilots are already underway, except for one, and they are just working on the focus and the action plan for that particular pilot project. That one is specifically focusing on the issue of transition, which has come up many times, and it's looking at transition in German in a cluster. The other pilots are underway, and you did hear evidence from Richard Talleyrand from Le Français en Écosse. Richard and his colleagues are involved in 3 of the pilots with support from both Education Scotland and SILT. And we, Fiona and I, have begun our support visits, and I would say that overall, first of all, the level of engagement and the level of enthusiasm is exceptionally high. We're seeing teachers in schools who are not MLPS trained and who'd really never been involved in delivering the language, thoroughly enjoying this opportunity to develop their skills. And perhaps more importantly, we're seeing children who are loving the experience as well. And there's a whole range of pilots, a range in terms of geographical areas, in terms of languages. Some are focusing on that +1 and how do we start in primary 1. Others are looking at how do we bring in a second language. And I would say overall, they're all at different stages and they're all doing different things, and that's actually what's very important, because what we want to see from these pilots is what works, what doesn't, what would any future training programme or programmes look like. And I don't think that we can say exactly yet, because these things are changing on a daily basis. But certainly from the particular schools I have visited and I'm supporting, and my staff are supporting, they are delighted to be part of the pilot, and are really grateful for this opportunity to develop what was already there and take it a step further.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is reference to the question. One of the questions we were asked earlier is that, I mean, there are 3 secondary schools involved in this. One with the cluster, but another 3 doing projects, and one is looking specifically at planning for the Languages for Life and Work Award with 5th year pupils who would normally be a group who would be quite disengaged with school, and they're linking that to hospitality and to future skills in that area. So very interesting spread of projects.
Are there any aspects, Convener, that need further development, would you suggest, when this programme is being rolled out?
Well, the training is one thing that we've mentioned. The programme of training that there was before for MLPS had its day, but now we would be looking at something quite a different model of training. For a start, the model that was there before was extremely costly, but it was also planned for a model which meant an hour a week for P6 and an hour for P7. It was very specific to that, and it was very much a one-size-fits-all in some areas. So we're looking at a different model, and one of the things we're hoping to get out of this is to see exactly how that might look, and also to look at one of the things that we, along with SILT, will be doing is to produce a framework for P1 to P5, because at the moment the experiences and outcomes for languages begin at second level. So we're looking at a framework of how that might be delivered. So that is something that's definitely on the cards.
Very much, thank you. Fiona?
Willie Coffey.
Thanks again, Convener. I just wonder if I could pick up that point that Fiona made there about the pilot and the involvement of the secondary school. It's a theme that again ran through the committee meetings prior to this, and that is it sufficiently flexible, do you think, looking ahead, to allow our children at the secondary school to study a modern language along with their science subjects? Because it's very important from the economic point of view to reinvigorate or to persuade students who want to study science and engineering perhaps, but to combine it with a language. Do you think we need to do a much more or a lot more, a little more to open up those opportunities for the children as they move through? Because we want to capitalise on the investment that we're making here. Absolutely. And allow the children to get the best of that when they move to secondary and beyond.
Yeah, already we've said that the language should be in the broad general education, and so is science, obviously, so that there is, schools are doing really good things there. Some are able to bring in full second language or second science through the broad general education as well. So patterns of really interesting use of timetabling structures through the broad general education while still maintaining that breadth, which is very important. Into the senior phase, what we're hoping is that the kind of language learning that we're seeing in best practice in schools and that we're now promoting through Curriculum for Excellence and through the kind of primary learning that we're looking at will encourage more people to enjoy languages and to want to continue with that study. And one of the things that will help them will be the kind of flexible provision that we're talking about now through SQA, because you're talking about encouraging young people to do even a unit in a language to support things like business education, to work with sciences. So many degrees now have science or business or law with a language. So you're trying to encourage people to see, pupils to see that there is scope out there, that there are degrees out there and jobs out there involving this. And also not just pupils who are going on to do degrees, but to encourage others, everyone, to see that there's a place for a language in their curriculum, because that will have benefits. It was very interesting to see at the moment Dundee City is looking at some form of links with business in terms of promoting languages in conjunction with SILT and Education Scotland. And we invited someone from Michelin to come, and they're based in Dundee, and he was explaining that all of their staff, including apprentices and so on, have to have some French, and therefore they give them training when they arrive if they don't already have it. And a lot of businesses do this, of course, and pupils are often not aware of this. It's a matter of getting the message out there. But also the notion that even if a company needs a language that you don't have, the fact that you're already skilled and have a language makes it far easier to learn a second one. So, but it's really interesting to see the way things are opening up in the senior phase.
Yeah, I think it's important to state that our languages for work purposes units are available to SCQF level 7 advanced higher level, and one of the ways that we're interested in promoting the use of the modern languages for work purposes unit, for instance, is together with the baccalaureate interdisciplinary project, so that could perhaps create an option for students in the senior phase who don't necessarily want to do or can commit to a national course, but can keep their languages in an applied fashion.
Excellent. Excellent.
If I could just add something there in terms of science. Part of our work is to promote language learning in general, but we've also been working with CERC, because we know that some universities have a strong language ambassador scheme. Strathclyde is one of them, but there are also the STEM ambassadors, and we think it's very, very powerful if a language ambassador and a STEM ambassador are speaking together in a school, because we're not competing. We're trying to show young people that these are key skills for their future, And so along with looking at flexible qualifications in the senior phase, it's about getting that message out to young people in schools and to parents, because we speak at parents' evenings about the transferable skills that language learning bring, and that these apply to whatever job you will have in the future. That international outlook, that flexibility, that problem solving, all of that comes from language learning, and it's a fantastic asset for an engineer to be able to say, I've also got some German or whatever. So we're working very, very closely with the science community to promote both science and languages, and rather than see one against the other.
Absolutely delighted to hear that. Thanks, Convener.
I think, and final question in this session, Claire Adamson.
It's just a supplementary to the points that Willie was asking about. We tend to think of the Comenius project as being language teachers interchanging. Is there an opportunity within the way that is set up at the moment for science teachers, maths teachers to come to Scotland to teach, just to actually offer some of the points that Willie was asking about?
It's not my area of expertise. I don't directly, look at the criteria for the programmes. I do know, however, that the Institut Français was bringing over and is bringing over science specialists who've been working in schools. So, as I say, it's not something I know a great deal about, but I'm aware that there have been initiatives in that area.
Thank you. Okay, I think that exhausts all of our questions for you today. Again, if we can extend an invitation, if there's anything else that you think that the committee needs to know about, we'd be very grateful to have that information. And just leave it to me to thank you on behalf of the committee for coming along today. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Bold again, I will make sure I have at my fingertips the number of primary, secondary and special schools.
Okay, there's going to be a brief 5-minute suspension, and if we're back at 4 minutes past 10, please. Welcome back to the European External Relations Committee. Moving on to agenda item 2 is our usual Brussels Bulletin put together by Dr Ian Duncan. Ian, if you want to talk us through the Brussels Bulletin.
Yes, thank you, Convener. You'll have noticed over the last few bulletins that the section called Developments in the Eurozone had shrunk slightly. But again, you'll notice that not in this bulletin, it has once again increased. Clearly quite a few developments, just a couple to draw your attention to. You will be aware, of course, of the developments in Italy. The dilemma now facing the Italian political system is that all the parties which secured significant support are against the broad terms of the likely engagement with debt, and that is going to cause significant problems in the way forward. The Italian Parliament meets on the 15th of March, so we'll know after that point exactly what the government will look like. A couple of smaller ones to note again. I say smaller, but not less important. Cyprus. The bailout for Cyprus has been delayed, but again, it's likely to be moving more quickly now, estimated at 17 billion, almost the size of its GDP. Another one, again, that's moving forward is developments in Slovenia. The Slovenian government has fallen. Again, they're likely to need a bailout, which could be around about 5 billion. So again, it's just a reminder that so much is going on in Europe that sometimes just seems to fly under the radar. A couple of other things. The multi-annual financial framework, you'll recall at the last meeting I said there was to be a European Parliament Office of Edinburgh presentation in Glasgow, and I went along to that. I've put in a report of that into the body of the text. A couple of things to note. This committee, of course, was very concerned about the potential reduction in structural funds for Scotland. There's a little bit in there raised by David Martin explaining why that is, which is if there is an overall pot of money and it's now divided by more regions which qualify, then each region gets less. And I've put in the regions which are expected to qualify. This is a domestic matter, of course, not an EU matter. This has to be resolved at a UK level. And I know work is being done on that. A couple of other points from that particular conference. You might remember at my last discussion here, I said that the Parliament was still concerned about the state of the multi-annual financial framework. George Lyon and several of the other MEPs were of the view that the MEPs would likely accept the overall reduction, but were not content with where the money lay within the overall pot, and they would look to try and move that, or allow greater flexibility to move that. Worth just being aware of that. One other thing I want to raise here, the common fisheries policy. You'll recall again in the past I've said that great progress was made on achieving an overall discard ban. But things are never quite as they seem in the EU, so of course it is nearly an overall discard ban, but there are now certain allowances for certain countries who are not able to meet the criteria, which again is a bit of a concern, and you'll see it's primarily the Iberian countries. I've given you a bit of an overview of the horse meat crisis situation, just again for your information to show how the EU functions in these areas. One other thing, and again I'm bringing this to the attention of the committee, the Life Plus Fund, which again puts money into sort of environmental projects. There's a call for proposals for 2013. Just to note that the UK does not normally use its full allocation. It just doesn't. So again, this is one where the bids, you have to bid in to get the money. It depends on the quality of your bid. But it's a reminder again that there is money out there, but we aren't always able to draw it down. This is only one more year to run, and then it goes into the next financial cycle. But it's just, again, to draw that to your attention. Happy to take questions on anything else in the bulletin.
Okay, just very, very quickly on the Life Plus thing. It's an immediate, we should ensure that our colleagues in the Rural Committee know about that, because obviously there's opportunities there.
Yes.
And the situation with the Eurozone, let's hope that beware the Ides of March is not what people are saying on the 15th of March, I think. 15th of March being a very significant day in Italian history, I think. Helen.
Just to congratulate Ian and his team on the bulletin. It's very full and very informative, and just really looking at the the horse meat crisis. I mean, obviously that's still an ongoing issue of real concern for people, and I think one of the directives that I believe is being developed, and maybe you could confirm this for me, is the food labelling directive in Brussels. And I mean, if you could just say to us how you think that will impact on the horse meat crisis. What difference would that have made if that directive had been in operation already?
Yes. I think the one thing that comes out of this particular crisis is that the law has been broken. That's the important thing. Fraud has been committed, and I think the greater concern about that is that the detection of the problem happened almost by accident, and the scale of the problem only became apparent when people began then to explore. So there are regulations in place which are meant to prevent this. So the laws exist. The dilemma, of course, Helen, is how they're enforced, and I think this is part of the problem. The labelling directive is an important one to ensure that people know what is in the packet and they know where it's come from. What I think we're seeing here is an example of the step before the labelling, where it actually has to be the monitoring within the various production houses for the product. And that clearly varies across the EU. So although there are clear standards for the EU as a whole, they are not being enforced adequately. And indeed, there are crimes being committed, which is even more troubling. The fact that crime is being caught, and again, there's a little bit in there about how that will likely go forward with Europol being involved. But the European Parliament has two views, one which is more regulation is needed, and the other view which is the regulation is there, it needs better enforcement. There may well be truth in both of those, but there's certainly an example of enforcement not working to the advantage of the consumer.
May convener as well come back and say that the other development in the paper that I think is particularly welcome is having the observations by the various MEPs, and that's really good to have that. And I noticed that the point that was made earlier by the convener, I think that's really further underlined by David Martin's contribution when he's talking about the extent to which the consequences, the unintended consequences for Scottish funding with regards to the agreement on the structural funds, is saying the potential impact could be to the tune of around €300 million less for Scotland. And obviously you're making the point that that's a matter for the member states to be involved in. And I do hope very much that the Scottish Government will, and I believe Nicola Sturgeon is, in fact, making the strongest possible representations, but I think that we as committee members maybe should be writing individually as well to our own political contacts, just, highlighting just how serious this is potentially, because we can't just lose €300 million out of our budgets and it not matter. I mean, it really matters enormously. So I just make that point, and I also agree with David 100% when he talks about being offended by the retention of tobacco growing subsidies. I too am hugely offended by that, and I think it's really time that the whole of Europe got together and addressed that. But I know that there's obviously interests within Europe that will stop that from being developed. And also to say the issue about the two homes for the European Parliament, Brussels and Strasbourg, it does seem to me to be a nonsense at such times of austerity that people have not tackled that issue.
One of the interesting speeches delivered in the European Parliament by President Hollande of France, he was asked questions after his speech about the fact that in an age of austerity, having two homes was perhaps a cost that the Parliament could do without. And he was very interesting. He said, no, this is a symbol of reconciliation across Europe. And it was pointed out a very expensive symbol. So yes, measured in hundreds of millions a year. So yeah.
Claire. Thank you. Can I just echo Helen's comments about the bulletin once again, Ian? I think it's a really useful and informative document. I would also like to just put on record that I really welcome the developments in an EU scientific advisory group. I think following on from the appointment of Professor Anne Glover in January 2012, this is a really important move forward so that we can ensure that this science-based and evidence-based policy making at the forefront in the EU.
Yes, it's been welcomed across the EU. Yes.
Okay, Rod.
Just following on from that slightly, has there been any controversy about the appointment of a scientist, albeit a very distinguished scientist from Israel, and from outside the EU to that group, or has that not caused ripples?
There are two scientists from outside the EU itself, Israel and Switzerland. No, is the answer. I've not picked up anything about that, nor can I explain to you why there has been an extension beyond. It may well be on the basis of their credentials, but I haven't heard of any concerns expressed.
Well, she's a Nobel Prize winner, so I suppose that might count in her favour. Secondly, just a small point or an issue in terms of the upcoming accession of Croatia, which is obviously a near neighbour of Slovenia. Are there any concerns about impacts on the Croatian economy with what's going on in Slovenia? I appreciate it. According to this, it's primarily a banking issue, but
yes, I suspect the risk of contagion is strong. Not just to Croatia, but to the whole Balkan region. Yes, there are concerns about that. The Slovenian situation has been bubbling along for quite some time, and has only broken through when the government was in effect dismissed by the Parliament. The Prime Minister was seen to have... It was a corruption issue, as I understand it, which eventually led to the fall of the government. But they've been keeping a lid on the situation. Now, there is a risk of contagion throughout the Balkans, but great efforts are being made now by the European Central Bank to ensure that all provisions are in place to guard against that, certainly.
Billy Coffey.
Thanks, Convener. I wonder if I could just broaden the discussion a wee bit to talk about the debt management measures in the Union and how they impact on the accession states. What I'm seeing, Convener, is, and what Ian's reporting on, is governments are falling with a bit of rapidity here on some of these issues, particularly on the austerity measures that they're bringing in. Various populations are objecting strongly. That's probably putting it mildly. To this, and we've seen that in Greece to a smaller extent. We're seeing it in Ireland. I saw it at the weekend with the British-Irish Parliamentary Assembly, where the Taoiseach was basically not manhandled, but there was a huge demonstration outside the conference that I attended on the austerity issue, and he dealt with it. Enda Kenny dealt with it really, really well and said, well, the problem's not going away, we're dealing with it. Is there any sense that you're getting in that across the Union they need to review their demands on debt management here? And I don't mean to suggest they should just forget all about it, because the problems are there, but it seems to me that governments are becoming under extreme pressure because of the debt management and austerity measures that they're having to bring in. Is there any sense that they're reviewing this to try to make it a bit more manageable for economies like Ireland and perhaps Slovenia and Cyprus and others? And the flip side of that question is, why are accession states clamouring to join the Union if they're about to face in a situation like this, where the European Union might therefore be asking them to introduce further austerity measures to be part of the club? It doesn't make a lot of sense that where they would be desperate to join in a scenario like this, but nevertheless they are.
Well, I think you've put together a series of questions that could be answered by a team of academics. If I can just give a little bit of an overview. The first statement is that no government which has gone to the polls during this crisis has survived. So all governments which have gone to the polls have fallen, which is the first thing to note. Some have then been replaced by technocratic governance, so not even a sort of democratically mandated government, which is a concern. The second thing about this is that the protests which are taking place, the ones we hear about, are only the tip of a vast iceberg. The protests are, east to west, north to south, and are significant. You ask if there's any suggestion of reviewing this. No, there isn't. The reason being that everyone's waiting for the German election. The German election, Chancellor Merkel has declared that this is the plan, this is what will happen, and the ability to adjust that in advance of that election, I suspect, is very limited. There is clearly, from a number of member states, grave concern. I mean, the sheer level of youth unemployment in the Mediterranean countries, once you tip beyond 50%, you would imagine it would be unsustainable. Everyone is crying out for some form of change, and what you're seeing now is that the current system is not working for people. It might be working for stability of banking or debt management or repayment of debt, but there's only so long that people will tolerate that. So I suspect that the German elections in the back end of the year will be the tipping point after which there will have to be serious change. The question will be whether Angela Merkel bucks the trend and her government survives the election or not. She's in the the contraposition of needing to be able to appear strong, because they've got more to lose by the reform. They would get less money back to their bankers and so forth. So they've got more to lose by relaxing, rather than the other ones which have got more to lose by seemingly tightening. So I think the challenge then will be what happens in the next 6 months. And in terms of the member states, or the would-be member states wishing to join, that's a reminder, however, that the EU is still a powerful organisation, still a powerful union for trade, for the ability of movement of ideas, for funding and so forth. So it's still a powerful body. I think that if I were saying something else, I think that the greater challenge is why some countries are still keen to join the euro. That would seem to be so unstable at the moment that the suggestion of joining and creating greater stability, I think, is debatable. So you have noted in here, for example, Latvia declaring its intention to join the euro on the 1st of January 2014, Poland now setting a date to its plans, albeit further away. I think that's an interesting issue, where those countries still believe that being part of a bigger bloc, albeit with its problems, albeit with its instabilities, is still better than being a smaller country with an isolated currency. So there is
the accession states, are they bringing their own banking crises in with them, or are they in a fairly healthy state? I mean, there's all the talk about the convergence criteria and being met and all that. It's been doing the rounds for years, and the UK's never met any of it that remains in. But so the smaller countries, the other countries that are wanting to join, are they matching up to the convergence criteria? Is their banking and financial institutions stable? You know, I don't get it. You know, if they're not, why are they coming in?
It's a good question. I would probably say this is not the time to buy shares in banks, would be my piece of advice. But a lot of these smaller countries were less affected by the direct crisis itself because their economies were not able to benefit. A lot of those within the family, if you like, were able to benefit from the interest rates within the Eurozone, which meant they were pegged to the German success. So the interest rates were allowed for bubbles to be created. Those on the outside were less directly affected by that, with the exception of countries which had a big banking sector like Iceland, which was already doing great things, albeit on a very unstable foundation. So I don't think the smaller nations which are coming in are bringing with them a banking crisis, but they will be affected by the broader issues that are going on. And there is no doubt that there is much instability yet to be calmed.
Let me just comment. For example, in Bulgaria, which is obviously one of the smaller nations which has already joined the EU, they have never required to borrow from the IMF, so they don't bring with them that instability because they've got a fairly stable economy, although they're affected and they had an impact from the rest of the EU, but they are required to join the euro by, I think it's 2014, and likewise with Romania too. So it's something that my understanding is that that's still progressing in the same way that Latvia had to sign up under the requirements of the treaty to join. So I'll just mention the Bulgarian context.
I think in a UK context, we've got our own troubles to seek anyway, because the austerity measures don't seem to be working either for the people or the banking sector, given that the figures out this week about the lack of lending, which is an issue, given that a good group of the banks are state-owned, and the fact that now, you know, the UK's economy has been downgraded from AAA status.
I think that makes it even more important that we press the questions all the time as to why the member state at a national level isn't doing its absolute utmost to draw down the funding that's entitled to be able to draw down. And the fact that it's mentioned in Ian's excellent report this morning, you know, under the LIFE programme rather, you know, that they're just not drawing even down that money. That's lamentable. Here we are in the UK, and there's all sorts of money that we could be drawing down, and the government is so busy bleating about the money they're putting in, they won't even think about the money at a national level that they could be taking down. It's outrageous.
One of the things I know the previous committee members had expressed concerns about the European structural funding situation, and you'll know that I had a topical question in that week to the Deputy First Minister. I think we are drawing up some plans carry that forward and maybe have the Deputy First Minister in front of committee. Maybe take a wee while to organise that, but I think you're absolutely right, Helen. I think, you know, if we impress on the government here, who have then got an opportunity to impress on the government at Westminster, then that's a way forward. I'm very, very conscious of the time because I know some people need to be in for general questions. There's just one thing in the report that I wanted to pick up on is the breach for the UK government on the VAT situation on installation materials. I think specifically we should raise that with our climate change colleagues on that issue, because it's about the government's new Green Deal programme, which obviously is something that we're very interested in given our climate change targets. I think on the Brussels Bulletin, we agreed to...
Just 1 second, Chair, if you
Helen,
don't mind.
Gonzalo.
Thank you. Helen, I wouldn't take that. In terms of upcoming events and meetings, and I see two in particular, the Agriculture and Fisheries Council, and I'm just wondering whether we would need additional representations there to lobby our case. Now, I know that our ministers will probably be at the event, but do we need anybody from this committee to be there?
A couple of things about that. I know Richard Lockhead, the Cabinet Secretary, has quite an impressive record of attendance at the Council. I don't think he's missed one. I'm not certain he's attending that one, but I would suggest by his record he would be. I'm going to be in Brussels next week and doing quite a bit of work around fisheries as well, so I should be able to both pick up on what's going on and report back to this committee on what I've learned in that particular regard. So yes, I think we should have adequate resources out there just now, but I think it's something to keep an eye on, because this meeting coming up is important. Actually, the one after that, the one into April, will be the more important one, where I think some of the key fisheries issues will be brought to bed.
Could I possibly actually go one stage further and suggest that we formally agree to allow you to make the decision if a presence was needed at short notice? You could actually do it without actually formally coming back to this committee for permission as such, because I think it's such an important issue that we should have that flexibility.
Yes, the convener would be...
I think that would be welcome. The only thing I would say about formal council meetings is it's the UK that chooses the delegation, is that right?
Yes, it is. It's the UK.
Well, I'm looking at it from the Scottish Parliament's point of view, and if we felt something was important that we needed additional support, then we shouldn't have to come to committee to get that.
If the convener is content to take that responsibility.
I'm
we may look for volunteers.
I'm sure.
Okay, so we'll get the Brussels Bulletin off to the relevant committees, highlighting the specific points to specific committees. Very, very quickly, always becomes a bit of a marathon at the end, a bit of a sprint at the end of this committee, is agenda item 3, which is a country plan inquiry, and we have specifically looking at the China plan. Myself, Claire Adamson and Jamie McGregor attended the launch of that last week, which was last Thursday morning, at the Scottish Salmon Company. We've maybe give some feedback. Jamie, it went into a lot of detail because a lot of the actual operation was in his region. I think I found the visit very, very interesting, very intriguing in how they maintain and manage and sustain their business overseas, and some of the challenges and the pressures that are within that. But I think we've got a wee note coming back to the committee on we did that day. Claire, you were there as well. Have you got any recollections you want to share?
Yeah, I would like to thank the Scottish Salmon Company for their time and hospitality on the day. It was a very interesting visit. What I took from their actual engagement in China was that they still did not feel fully linked in and supported into the networks that were there. And although they had an office on the ground and someone who was based there, they didn't really get the feeling that they had that link up. But one of the most significant things I took from it certainly was that in terms of their engagement with China, they actually used the New Zealand government website to get the best practice and advice about how to do that. And they said that was very, very useful, but they'd got very little in terms of support from the websites and the support that are here. So I think that's certainly something we should be looking into.
Okay.
Chair, I would like to suggest that we maybe look at inviting TTI and Scottish Enterprise to come and perhaps give us a presentation of what exactly they can do or do for small companies in Scotland. and particularly explore new businesses. We do a lot of dairy products which we're not really known for overseas, although we're known for it in Scotland and possibly the US and Canada, but nowhere else in the world. And I think it's a good opportunity for them to explain to us what exactly they're doing for small businesses and how they're engaging with them and supporting them, whether they're doing it from a British industrial point of view or Scottish enterprise point of view.
We have some panels as part of that. Sorry, we have some panels as part of that, and they are certainly to be invited. So, yeah.
Lauren, actually, our other clerk, is doing a power of work looking at businesses, organisations, support networks, and how we can link into that for the future inquiry. So, we can tend to move on. Thank you. That completes our meeting for today. Our next meeting will be the 21st of March, and we'll be hearing from business representatives on our foreign language inquiry. See you then. Thank you very much.